Top European Union officials are in China, marking 50 years of diplomatic ties, as trade tensions between the two sides are growing.
When our concerns are not addressed, our industry and citizens will demand that we defend our interests.
Yeah, and the dynamics, of course, around this trading relationship have shifted so dramatically in recent months. And now, of course,
China is sidelining von der Leyen, and it hit Europe like a sudden slap that's humiliating and impossible to ignore. It was awkward optics. Beijing was sending a message wrapped in diplomatic steel. So what's really going on behind this perfectly back to the moment everything shifted? It was September 5th when Ursula von der Leyen stepped off her plane in Beijing, expecting the classic presidential treatment. But what she got was a small minibus. And the wildest part was that Chinese state media didn't even bother pretending she mattered. Barely a headline or a mention. The silence felt intentional, almost cruel. In that moment, it felt like China was telling the EU, "You're not calling the shots anymore." And honestly, they meant every word of that message without ever saying it out loud. But this wasn't some sudden humiliation. It was a setup months in the making. In July 2025, China abruptly cut the big anniversary summit from 2 days to 1. At the time, it felt odd but not dramatic. But later, we learned the truth. This was Beijing's first move to sideline Ursula. Xi Jinping even said privately, "They did not come to understand. They came to give orders." And everything starts making sense when you hear that quote. To China, Europe wasn't coming to negotiate, but to lecture them, to remind China how it should behave, how markets should run, how diplomacy should be shaped. And China wasn't having it, especially not in 2025, when their global confidence is through the roof.
I think the expectations are unfortunately very low. We're expecting, at the very least, some agreement on a joint statement about climate action, which is one of the few things that China and the EU can agree on.
Inside Beijing, officials had already decided the EU needed to be humbled. The Chinese are tired of Europe pushing on Russia. Human rights, subsidies, critical minerals, the whole moral diplomacy package. And in their eyes, Europe didn't have the economic power to back any of it up.
So what does that mean? It could mean that relations could improve from here or deteriorate from here. It doesn't say a lot. But then to put it in more concrete terms, I think they're looking to have some agreements on the trade imbalance between China and the EU.
Here's where things get even more brutal. While Ursula was preparing her talking points about fairness and rebalancing trade, China was quietly moving European CEOs into the real rooms where the actual decisions were being made. Deals worth billions flowed across those tables. Meanwhile, Europe's political leadership was literally outside the door. I'll be honest with you, that's the part that made my jaw drop. Because the minibus was symbolic, sure, but this was structural. China deliberately split Europe's political arm from its business arm, and it worked. CEOs got access, politicians got protocol, and protocol in Beijing means nothing.
As our cooperation has deepened, so have the imbalances. We have reached an inflection point. Rebalancing our bilateral relation is essential.
The clash was more than just diplomatic. It was philosophical. Europe still believes in values-based diplomacy. Ursula came in preaching about human rights, competition rules, moral responsibility. But China believes in power diplomacy, numbers, markets, leverage. And between the two, only one side controlled the rare earth minerals and the manufacturing pipelines Europe desperately depends on. Take the EU's 2025 sanctions on Xinjiang. Brussels saw them as a moral stand, but Beijing saw them as a provocation. And honestly, they weren't wrong. You can't pressure a country you're economically dependent on. And let me be real with you. The hierarchy has changed. Europe came expecting to shape the conversation. Instead, China reshaped Europe's place in it.
The European Union is China's largest trading partner, and China is the EU's third. Our bilateral trade in goods now exceeds 2 billion euros per day.
Let me tell you, this is the part of the story where I stopped blaming China for the power play and started realizing just how exposed Europe really is. The EU walked into this relationship acting like a heavyweight, but beneath the confidence was a massive economic sinkhole nobody wanted to talk about. By 2025, Europe's trade deficit with China had blown up to somewhere between 300 and 400 billion euros. Meanwhile, Chinese exports to Europe kept climbing, up 8.2% year on year, even as political trust was collapsing. That's when I realized Europe wasn't just losing leverage, it had already lost it. Hit subscribe button to get more updates on trade relationship between China and the European Union.
The relations need to be mutually beneficial. And to achieve this, it is vital for China and Europe to acknowledge our respective concerns.
And Ursula tried to counter it. I'll give her that. She came to Beijing asking for less overcapacity, fairer access, fewer distortions, all the right words, all the right arguments. But every time she said those things, I couldn't shake the feeling that China already knew the EU didn't have the power to enforce any of it. It's hard to demand fairness from someone who supplies the EVs, batteries, solar panels, and steel your industries rely on. And Europe's industries, they're drowning in those cheap imports. But the trade imbalance wasn't even the scariest part. Rare earths were. And this is where things get really uncomfortable for Brussels. China controls 98% of Europe's rare earth supply. And while Europe was juggling this economic dependence, it decided to add another layer of complication: Russia. The EU spent months trying to convince China to pressure Moscow to help end the Ukraine war, to use its influence for peace. But China never budged. They didn't ignore Europe out of spite. They ignored Europe because their no-limits partnership with Russia is one of their core geopolitical assets.
The European countries and Europe has supported Ukraine with 187 billion euros. During the same period, we have imported.
And that division inside Europe, China exploited it perfectly. The EU couldn't present a unified stance even if it tried. Eastern Europe is firmly pro-US and aggressively anti-Russia. Western Europe keeps talking about strategic autonomy but can't align internally. Southern Europe, struggling with economic recovery, is more open to Chinese investment and less excited about confrontation. When you realize how fractured Europe really is, you understand exactly why China didn't take Brussels seriously. A divided EU is predictable, it's manageable, it's easy to influence without ever raising your voice. The real humiliation was structural. Europe entered that room with moral arguments, but China held the minerals, the markets, the supply chains, and the geopolitical cards. And once you see that clearly, you understand why Beijing didn't have to play nice. Because Europe wasn't negotiating from strength, it was negotiating from dependency.
Unlike other major markets, Europe keeps its market open to Chinese goods. This reflects our long-standing commitment to rules-based trade.
And here's the part that made me laugh. Overnight, Ursula's tone changed. The woman who walked into Beijing warning China about fairness, democracy, rules, and moral responsibility suddenly switched to talking about strategic cooperation and shared goals. And while reading her statements the next morning, you might think, well, someone definitely got a reality check. It wasn't a pivot out of wisdom. It was a pivot out of weakness. When you get sidelined that publicly, you don't double down. Instead, you start smoothing the edges.
As we said to the Chinese leadership, for trade to remain mutual, beneficial,
it must become more balanced.
Then the EU did what the EU always does when embarrassed. It announced big flashy plans, anti-dumping rules, rare earth diversification, and a complete rewiring of supply chains. It all sounded bold until analysts started poking holes in every idea. Most of these plans would take years to build, billions to fund, and political unity the EU absolutely does not have. It felt like Brussels was putting on a tough act for the cameras, hoping no one would remember they were emotionally crushed just 24 hours earlier. Meanwhile, and this is the part that really stings, European businesses were thriving during the same summit. While Ursula was being escorted into vans, CEOs were being escorted into boardrooms. Deals worth billions were being signed. Access was being granted. China didn't shut the door on Europe. It just shut the door on European politicians. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. It was a full-blown, split-screen moment. Europe's economy was hugging China, while Europe's politics was terrified of China. And Beijing understood that dynamic perfectly. They knew Europe couldn't afford to walk away economically, no matter how offended their political leaders felt. And that brings us to the bigger, uncomfortable truth. The world order Europe grew up believing in is gone. For decades, Europe was the senior partner, the rule maker, the moral referee of international politics. But China doesn't see Europe that way anymore. To Beijing, Europe is useful sometimes, annoying, but never the leader in the room.
Welcomes competition, we like competition, but competition has to be fair. We need to see progress on this issue.
China now imagines a world with no Western referee, no European lectures, no one scanning their policies for moral approval. And yes, the minibus incident became a symbol of exactly that shift. The EU is stuck walking a tightrope between Washington and Beijing, wobbling with every step, because one wrong move can cost them either political credibility or economic survival. And Europe's future could be one of these three bad options in a trench coat. First, align closely with Washington and risk losing China's market. Or lean deeper into China and face political backlash at home. Or attempt true autonomy, which requires economic and military power Europe simply doesn't have right now. So now the question that haunts Brussels, and honestly shapes global geopolitics, is painfully simple. If China could humiliate Europe this easily, what exactly might come next?